When the French were here, they used to call the road that runs from Hue northwards towards Hanoi the street without joy. Well, the city of Hue itself has now become a city without joy.
Thank you for joining me for part 2 of Journalist in Combat Vietnam. Part 1 was an overview, and here in part 2 is my interview with Vietnam War correspondent Martin Stuart-Fox, who was close friends and lived with the legends Sean Flynn, Tim Page, Steve Northup, Joe Galloway, and others. Martin will tell us about his life as a Vietnam War journalist and stories of Page, Flynn, Galloway, and others. There is lots to unpack on this subject, which I will do through several videos. Before Martin begins to talk, here are some journalistic highlights of his work in Vietnam, so you'll have a better background when he speaks. Fox left Laos in May 1965 for Saigon, working for UPI. M. Page had already left Laos for Vietnam, taking a job as a stringer for Reuters after he had made a name for himself photographing and covering the Lao attempted coup d'etat in January 1965, which Martin will talk about. Tim Page and Simon Dring were waiting for him at the airport. And whisked Martin to their new flat at 47 Bui Thi Duan Street, a location that would develop a notorious reputation and generate a television mini-series innocently named Frankie's House. Martin was Australian, but UPI immediately sent him to cover American units, and his first field trip, his first war story, was the aftermath of the Battle of Dong Xoai. He flew in at short notice on a helicopter out of Tan Son Nhut Air Base to interview the American camp commander and get a first-hand report on the fighting. Fighting continued on the perimeter while he was there. He writes,
"Suddenly there was a shout.
"Falling short!"
I looked up to see a stick of bombs tumbling towards us. We threw ourselves on the ground, as the bombs hit close enough to shower us with dirt, and stayed down as the forward air controller frantically radioed the flight commander. As the next bombs hit the tree line, a couple of shaken correspondents returned to the shelter of the camp. The rest of us continued on to the perimeter, where bodies were piled up against the wire. The commander told us the attack had been led by a woman. I watched as a soldier turned over the bodies, and there she was, young, perhaps 25, with long hair tied back. Like the other attackers, she wore black pajamas of the kind worn by any peasant farmer. But clenched in her hand was a pistol. The soldier tried to free the weapon from the girl's hand, but it was clamped closed in the grip of death. I stood looking down at her, defiant in death, the pistol a sign that she was an officer, a leader. What made a young woman like this lead what she must have known was, for her at least, a suicidal attack on a well-defended camp? One thing I did know, these were not adversaries who would easily be defeated. Interpretation was left to think pieces. So what seemed to me conclusions to draw, about courage and commitment and morale, went largely unreported. Back in the office I wrote that the attack had penetrated a corner of the perimeter, that it had been led by a woman, that she was young, and that her pistol could not be prized from her grip.
UPI sent Martin up to Da Nang to relieve Joe Galloway and cover the Marines. He recounts one night drinking with a Marine major and recounting the value of French experiences in central Vietnam, where the Marines were at that time. The Marine replied, "We ain't got nothing to learn from the Frenchies, they lost." Because of sniper fire, the Marines were beginning to expand their tactical area of operations beyond the Da Nang base, and Martin went with them on one of their first operations. His and Morley Safer's reporting would create a stir back in the States all the way to Washington. He writes,
"We went in with the first wave of troops, landing in muddy, recently harvested rice paddies outside the village of Chow Sun. On landing, we immediately came under sniper fire. The Marines responded with machine guns and grenades targeting the tree line ahead of us, before moving forward. And I followed, running crouched low, from one paddy dike to the next, trying to keep my camera out of the mud. Once they reached the tree line, the Marines fanned out. As I dashed after them into the village, I came across a terrible scene. A woman had been shot in the face, her body prone, as if laid out, head turned to one side, blood pooled on the hard ground, and around her squatting and wailing, children and an old couple. She was clearly the mother, still young, perhaps in her mid-30s, taken from her children and her parents, and from the husband who was nowhere to be seen. The men had fled. Whether or not they were active Viet Cong, the Marines would assume them to be, and either shot running away or tied up and handed over for interrogation to the South Vietnamese military. UPI ran the photograph I took of this heartrending scene."
Morley Safer of CBS on this operation and at another part of this perimeter shot his famous footage of Marines setting fire to the thatched roofs of houses with Zippo lighters.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about. The old and the very young. The Marines have burned this old couple's cottage because fire was coming from here.
Safer's film and Martin's photos were not the image the Marines or the Johnson administration wanted to project, and Marine headquarters in Hawaii called Martin the next day to complain. A few days later, Martin says he was quietly told that the next time he accompanied a Marine operation, he would not return. UPI pulled him from the Marine Da Nang operations. The next morning, President Johnson called Frank Stanton, the head of CBS, a friend of Johnson's, and said, "Hello, Frank, this is your president. Are you trying to blank me?" Johnson said Safer was probably an agent of the Kremlin and had to be fired. A Marine press officer in Da Nang called CBS the Communist Broadcast System. Marines said Safer had provided the grunts a Zippo lighter and asked them to burn the hut. But Safer had interviewed Marines who burned the huts.
Do you ever have any private thoughts about any private regrets about some of these people? You leaving homeless?
I feel no remorse. I don't imagine anybody else does. You can't expect to do your job and feel pity for these people.
President Johnson frequently complained of this press, and in the following recording of Johnson in conversation with Washington Star White House correspondent Horner, President Johnson vents his ire at American journalists, particularly Marvin and Bernard Kaub of CBS News, expresses frustrations with his staff, and highly lauds General Westmoreland.
Hello? Good morning, Mr. President.
Hi, Jack.
We need guidance this morning, sir, on how much weight to give. Press reports from Seoul. A Seoul, South Korean newspaper, sir.
Guidance, is that all you want?
Yes, sir.
No quotation?
That's right.
No attribution? No connection?
That's right.
Give it absolutely none.
Absolutely
Your
not.
press is lying like drunken sailors every day. First thing I waked up this morning was trying to figure out, after seeing CBS, the two cabs, watching the networks, reading the morning papers, was how can we possibly win and survive as a nation and have to fight the press's lies. I watched both cabs on CBS. Both of them were totally inaccurate. I watched the cab out at Korea. It just hasn't happened. Not one goddamn thing to it. I assume it's what you're talking about is the agreement on prisoners. There is no agreement.
Yeah.
All it does, it looks like that we are leaking, which would infuriate a man. It's just exactly like my asking you if I could marry your wife. Now, you know about how much you have decided I could do that as of now. You've made no decision whatever. You have heard of it because I mentioned it. Now, that's about all that's happened in these conferences. We have told them very strongly how we feel about this thing. They have not given us any response that can go beyond my press conference statement the other day. The other is just pure invented out of the big free air.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is very helpful because I understand the Post in its final edition put a banner headline on a story that they'd agreed in principle.
They have not agreed at all.
No.
Now, they might do it any moment. And what you've got is y'all have charged credibility so much that everybody here thinks that in order to keep from being assassinated by the McCarthys of the press, he's got to admit a little error. That's the cheapest insurance he can take.
Yes, sir.
McNamara does it yesterday. Others do it. Bill Bundy did it this morning. All of them want to side in a little bit enough with the enemy or with the critic or with the prober to buy himself just a little insurance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a damn disgrace to the country. And I don't know whether we're going to survive if we keep on doing that. I don't know. It's just the most difficult thing I have ever dealt with. Now, we have had 2 or 3 meetings there, but we are not off the dead center at all. That's like Drew Pearson this morning says about Westmoreland. To say that Westmoreland was considering being replaced and fired would be just as sensible as saying I went to Crosby Noyes and said I'd like to get Jack Horner removed, or he's been here a long time, or he oughtn't to be here, or something else. That's just as untrue as it could be. There's nobody works for me that's been more satisfactory all the time, 100% of the time, than Westmoreland and his wife and his children and his family. I've never mentioned him in my life to Rivers or Thurman. I've never discussed the subject with either one of them. I want him to stay there just as long as he can, just like Rusk.
Yes.
Unless I promote him to something else. I'd be glad to see Rusk president. And I might make Westmoreland someday chairman of the Joint Chiefs or chief of staff of the Army. All of them's term come up. These Wheeler's comes up in 4 years, and Johnson comes up at 4 years, and all that's June 30th. So that could be. So they scare you by saying you're getting ready to fire him, either to make you keep him there or to make you bring him in here, and then they'll say you're incredible. And it's just a hell of a thing. Now, the truth of business is he has done an expert job. Anybody that can lose 400 and get 20,000 is pretty damn good.
Yes, sir.
And I don't admit that this is a communist victory. And I don't think anybody but a goddamn communist admits it.
Yes.
That's what I think. And I just think they're using us, just playing games around us. And nearly everybody I talk to tries to find out what's wrong with our boys, our country, our leadership, our men. Our president's a liar, our Westmoreland's no good. Anybody that differs with him. When McNamara leaves, why, he becomes a hero. He was just a screwball you ever saw as long as he's in there.
Yeah.
And that's just what's wrong. So you can just be sure from me that I've read every dime's worth of report that's come in here. There's not one thing to it. We are talking. We are telling them that they ought to release these people, and then we'll go into any collateral matter they want to go into. But they have not agreed to one damn dime thing, nor have we agreed to anything.
Yes.
During one later operation with the Marines near Quidong, Martin was teamed with Japanese photojournalist Koichi Sawada. As jets bombed a village on the other side of a deep canal, civilians were fleeing, and a woman and her children started traversing the swift channel. Sawada took this picture that won him the 1965 World Press Photo of the Year and the Pulitzer Prize for News Photography. Martin wrote the story. On another operation with Sawada, he and Martin took pics, but it was this particular pic that won the World Press Photo of the Year 1966. Sawada became the most celebrated photojournalist in Japan. Later, Sawada covered the war in Cambodia, where he was executed by the Khmer Rouge. In 2013, Martin, along with other former war correspondents, attended the dedication ceremony of a memorial to 37 journalists and photographers who died covering the war in Cambodia between 1970 and 1975. Although a UPI reporter, 5 of Martin's color photographs appeared in Time magazine's feature cover story of the war that highlighted the 1st Cav Division near An Khe. The Times reporter had missed the helos out to the battle, and since UPI favored black and white photos, Martin filled the gap. He remarked that UPI was not happy with his moonlighting, but Time paid well. He speaks affectionately of the Montagnards. He visited some U.S. Special Forces camps in the Central Highlands, arriving in a couple of open jeeps. Upon arrival, they were surrounded by children, who greeted them by climbing aboard. So he was amazed when the Americans just tossed their weapons and other equipment in the back and walked off. "Wouldn't it get stolen?" he asked. To be told, "You can leave anything in the jeep and it won't be touched. These are Montagnards. They don't steal." Returning to An Khe by helicopter, in mid-flight there was an explosion and the helicopter crashed, exploding on the ground just after the crew cleared from the crash. No one died, but the pilot broke his back and leg, never to walk again. Everyone was injured, and the crash was picked up on the wires and broadcast in the States. Once Martin had timed his arrival in a town with Hoahau villagers to coincide with a pacification visit by Prime Minister Win Kao Ki. About half an hour into Ki's speech, Martin noticed that people were becoming restless, and he asked a local official if they were unhappy about what the Prime Minister was saying. "No," the guy replied. "Ki speaks with a northern accent, and they can't understand a word he says." Journalist Joe Galloway was living in Frankie's house with Martin, and after Martin's helicopter crash, Galloway replaced Martin covering the 1st Air Cav, and in that famous battle, the only correspondent to fly into Landing Zone X-ray. Martin writes that afterwards, back in Frankie's house, they administered camaraderie and pot, but the experience marked Galloway for life, as he received a Bronze Star for his actions, one of only 4 journalists to be so decorated during the Second Indochina War, and the only one for acting under fire. Martin's own excursion into the Ia Drang came 5 months later, shown in this pic, in the course of Operation Lincoln, which occurred in the same area as the first battle. Martin says one other incident during his time in Vietnam profoundly impacted him.
Dustoff, this is Dustoff 163. I have a good copy. We'll be leaving Cu Chi at this time for the mission.
On 31 January 1966, he was covering Operation Masher. In the village of An Thai, Martin and others were pinned down by withering fire in a cemetery. It turns out a South Vietnamese army unit had mistaken the Americans for Viet Cong, were firing on them, and 3 GIs were killed and 5 wounded. Martin writes,
"The next morning we returned to Saigon, and that evening attended the 5 o'clock follies, where, to our amazement, the fact that 3 American soldiers had died as a result of friendly fire, and 5 more wounded, was not even mentioned. Both were just included in overall daily theater-wide figures. Those of us who were there told what had happened, but the briefing officer said he could not confirm our account because he had no such information. After all we had been through, I was furious. Not providing a true account, hiding the fact that casualties were due to faulty communications and coordination between American and South Vietnamese forces, was to distort the truth. Who was covering up for whom I never discovered, but the failure to report accurately an incident in which Americans had pointlessly died reinforced a suspicion of official statements, whether from the military, governments, or politicians, that I have retained all my life."
To avoid burnout, bureaus would rotate journalists between the field and Saigon. In Saigon, Martin was assigned to cover demonstrations of Vietnamese university students, and this photo shows paramilitary police beating and bloodying Martin. Martin would spend a year and a half in Vietnam, accompanying U.S. and South Vietnamese troops on night operations, ground support missions from the air, combat operations, and pacification sweeps. And now, Martin speaks.
A couple of young journalists who went to Vietnam, Tim Page and Simon Dring, had gone down to Vietnam before me, and then UPI sent me down. We were all in Laos together. We all shared a house together, and so we looked for a house in Saigon. And actually, Simon and another guy, a Cuban American, found the place, and the Cuban American soon went back to the States, and a couple other people were posted by UPI to Saigon and just moved in. So in the end, we had 6 of us there. There were 6 rooms, and because the guy who looked after us, a Chinese fellow, and his wife, they prepared our food, cleaned up, and all that sort of thing. They were a couple who lived at the back, and his name was Frankie, and so we always referred to it as Frankie's house, and that's how it was known to the press corps at the time. I guess in Saigon at that time, this was pretty early on, so we're talking about 65 and 66. This was the biggest story around was Vietnam. So most of the people that got posted to Saigon were representatives of anything from the New York Times to the AP. Generally were seasoned correspondents. They had status and seniority in their organizations, and so they were the ones that could get the nod and get to Saigon. We didn't get there that way. we just were wandering around the Far East and came together in Laos and got into journalism purely accidentally. And so we were much younger. We had an entirely different background. We were not professional journalists. We learnt on the job. And so there was a sort of division in the press corps, and between the journalists that mostly stayed in Saigon and were older guys, and our group of sort of young non-journalists in a way. So there were just these 2 very different groups. But when, say, CBS or NBC sent out TV journalists, they tended to be younger because they had to get out in the field too, and they've had equipment to cart around, and so they tended to be younger, and they tended to gravitate towards Frankie's house too. So people like Jack Lawrence or Tom Corpora and some others, and someone like freelancer like Sean Flynn ended up gravitating pretty naturally to Frankie's house. So it got a bit of a reputation, if you wanted to try out a bit of, well, you could always get it at Frankie's house. I mean, Frankie could get it anyway. Frankie used to go out on his motorbike and pick up the little guy, brought a few pipes back and roll, It was just that type of.
Did the U.S. ambassador place Frankie's house off limits solely due to its ill repute party-wise, or because he was afraid U.S. government personnel would pass along confidential information?
I think it was probably more of the latter. We took to sending out invitations, printed invitations to our parties, and it just became a thing we did, you know. So we sent these to the younger members in the embassies, say third secretaries, or some of the girls working in the office and that sort of thing. And I think you know, as word got around that these parties got a bit wild in the end, that the powers that be, the ambassador, just really didn't want one of his staff getting, you know, high and telling us things that he shouldn't be telling us. I think that was really more to the point. But you know, people came anyway. So.
Did the older media resent you young journalists, or did they see you as a useful component to collect news?
Yes, I think there are various factors that were at play here. So quite a number of these guys, older representatives from major newspapers, particularly in the United States, had covered wars before. They'd been in the Congo, they'd been in Korea. They were war correspondents. They saw themselves as war correspondents. But in the case of Vietnam, you know, if you are the sole representative of a newspaper or something, then you really had to stick around Saigon for most of the time. You couldn't go out into the field for more than just a day. So fly out on the helicopter, try and see what was happening in some operation, which mostly meant hanging around the command post, and then coming back that evening and filing. But we were out for, I mean, I'd spent 6 weeks on end with the 1st Air Cavalry Division. I never came back to Saigon at all, just phoned in because the news agencies, the Associated Press and the AP in particular, but also AFP and Reuters, had bureaus in Saigon that were manned 24 hours a day. And so we could phone stories in and they would be filed. But if you were the sole representative of your news organization, you couldn't do this because each evening there were the briefings to attend, the official briefings, both of MACV, the Military Assistance Command, and quite often the Vietnamese too would have a news conference. And so, you know, if you were not there, you're not going to get that story. So really, it was quite difficult if you were the sole representative of your organization. You always had to juggle between going on a major operation, seeing what was actually happening, get a bit of color, as we used to say, and getting the whole story served up to you back in Saigon. But for the news agencies, they also wanted to have personal stories. So we, in accompanying the troops, one of the things that was absolutely essential was to get names and hometowns, because both the AP and the UPI would be, you know, providing news to those newspapers in those hometowns. So we always had to get names and addresses.
How did the grunts view you?
Yes, you got some funny reactions. You know, what the hell are you guys doing here? You don't have to be here. Why are you here? You know, and we said, well, we've got a story to get. You know, we want to find out what's happening in this war. But they would pick up my accent, of course, and say, oh, you know, where are you from? And I'd say Australia. And that sometimes people would ask, hey, you speak quite good English. What language you speak in Australia? So Yeah, I could have said Timbuktu. They had some of those guys had no idea where Australia was. But for the most part, they were very welcoming. You were sharing their danger, and they respected that. I think. And I think Mike Herb was quite right when he said that a lot of those guys had that respect. For the photojournalists, of course, they had to get pictures of what was happening. But for correspondents like me out in the field, I had to talk to the officers and get some idea of what was happening. We always got briefed before going out in the field, but we never knew how long we were going to be out there because they never knew how long the operation was going to last. So a lot of the difficulties that we had were getting the story out. I mean, if you're out in a rice paddy somewhere, the only way you could get the story to Saigon was through military radio. And we were right down the priority list for that. So it was quite difficult, and you could spend hours trying to get through to Saigon on the radio.
What was the motivation for officers to talk to reporters? One, to spin the news, or two, get noted as in, look, Mom, I'm in the news, or both?
Yes, that's a difficult one because as far as the wire services are concerned, every correspondent was expected to take photographs. I mean, I took 2 or 3 cameras in every time, and every photographer was supposed to get a story. So they had to also get names and addresses of any guy they had in their frames. So you had to get in where the action was. And it didn't matter whether you were a journalist or a journalist photographer or a photographer journalist, if you see what I mean. So one way to get an action shot from the photographic side was to go in with the medevacs, because that meant that there had been some kind of contact with the VC, and there was something, a story about what had happened. But for the correspondents, when they got in there, they had to get more detail if they possibly could. So that usually meant ending up with talking to people in the command center. It might have been a small platoon-sized operation, and your local commander was a lieutenant, captain, the highest. That is, if you flew in with a medevac chopper. So in a way, this was just a matter of getting information, and people that you talked to cooperated. I don't think it was a matter of getting their story across or really getting in the press at all. The press, by the way, every journalist in Vietnam had the honorary rank of captain, and we always ate in the officers' mess. We had rights to travel on helicopters anywhere around, or get flights on. We could bump a GI on a flight if we had to get the story out, provided obviously that they were not wounded. What we couldn't bump, of course, was on a medevac. So you could get isolated in there and end up walking through the rice paddies for 2 more days before you could get out. Because we had a fully staffed bureau in Saigon, they would be along at all the evening press conference, which was called the 5 o'clock Follies, and so they could get a story out, even if we had been in the field, had been unable to get through. So the wire services would send a first take on a story, and then follow it up when they got more information, and so on like that. So that could go through, a story could have several takes, and the newspapers, say in the east of the United States, would get these earlier takes, and then the later takes would be in time for papers in towns further west, cities further west. So you always had to think also of AM leads and PM leads. So you had the news agencies were providing stories for both morning papers and afternoon papers. So you had to keep thinking about that. It was a 24-hour thing for the news agencies.
If a news story could have several iterations, why were news agencies concerned with beating competitors by 7 minutes?
Because we were also providing services to radio. So none of the radio stations, I mean, across the United States, local radio, and in other parts of the world, of course, we were providing services across dozens of countries, the two major news agencies, and even in somewhere like France, that had its own Agence France Presse, correspondents in Vietnam. The news bureaus of somewhere like Le Monde would also take AP and UPI. They take the American agencies as well. And so we were also providing radio. We had guys doing radio takes. I did a couple of them, but it was not. I wasn't very good at radio, I don't think. I stuck to photography and stories. But UPI was in the bureau in Saigon. The guys there were recording radio tapes on these stories. Now, on radio, if you could get your agency mentioned, on a breaking news story, we've just heard the latest case, UPI is reporting, and then radio stations, they might be able to sell the service to some other radio station that's currently taking the AP, because we get our stuff on, consistently before the AP does. So there was that sort of competition. So it was really radio that you got a result. We were 7 ahead. We got it out on the wire, and we got it out on radio.
During your time in Vietnam, did you ever step back to take a reflective look of your place in history, or what reporters were doing in a larger sense, or were you just concerned with the daily grind of getting stories out?
We were working for a wire service. It was made very clear to us that what they wanted was factual information. If you got some information out in the field, you had to tell the bureau who gave it to you. Colonel so-and-so, captain this, or sergeant major somebody or other. They wanted specific quotes from specific people, and this was just to tell the basic story about what it was like fighting a war in Vietnam. And that was separated from what we used to call think pieces or opinion pieces, where you could give your views about the conclusions that you'd come to. And those were more thoughtful ones. I did a series, for instance, on pacification. I was in a helicopter crash, and UPI said, well, you better go off and stay out of the war for a little while. And so I visited each of the 4 pacification projects that they had going in different parts of Vietnam at that time, and wrote 4 articles, one about each of them, and then sort of step back and said, well, is pacification working? What's wrong with the program that we have at the moment? How long is it going to take to so-called pacify this country? So there was a clear separation in the wire services between think pieces and factual information that was sheeted home to some specific person. I mean, for anyone from the ambassador to a GI on an operation. There was always a problem of intelligence in Vietnam. How accurate was the intelligence about Viet Cong main force movements through a particular area, or whether they were, occupying a particular villages and so on. So you're always, and so one of the principal means or forms of military operation in Vietnam was the sweep and destroy. And the idea was to just sweep through the village and try and actually kill Viet Cong. And it all came back down to this idea of the body count. As Ho Chi Minh told the French, you will kill 10 times as many of my soldiers as we kill of yours, but we will win this war. And they did. And it was the same in Vietnam. The idea was the body count. So every evening you got the body count phoned in from that day. How many of each American unit would phone in to MACV, how many Vietnamese they've killed, and this would be summed up and given to the press as a number of Vietnamese dead. But for us out on these operations, we could see people getting killed who were, to the best of our knowledge, not Vietnamese, not Viet Cong, I mean. They might be dressed in black pajamas, but a lot of these guys were old, or they were women. Well, were they couriers for some Viet Cong unit? Who were the Viet Cong? Nobody knew. And and so we would end up with anybody who was in black pajamas and dead was counted in the body count. And a lot of this stuff was just guesstimate. I'll give you an example. I flew in a ground support mission in, what the hell was it, an F-100 or something like that. And we were called in to hit a VC position in this village. And we could see people running from that village, because as soon as it was targeted by a forward air controller with a white phosphorus or a smoke grenade or something or other, then people knew that the jets would be coming in and they'd be hitting the village. So they were running back into the jungle behind. So by the time we swooped in, me sitting behind the pilot and dropped our loads, it was in the jungle behind the village. And the forward air controller said, well, I think you've got so many. And they'd give you a number. And there was no way in the world he could have counted how many there were. Do you count how many are running out of the village? Do you get a percentage of those? So we were credited, that Air Force unit was credited with a certain number of KIA. And that was part of the addition that was served up to the press at in the 5 o'clock follies. And that's one of the reasons they were called the 5 o'clock follies. I mean, this was just, a lot of this was just, we didn't put much store by it. I spent almost 2 years in Laos. No, it was about 20 months or something, in Laos, covering the war from that perspective and watching what was happening, watching the build-up and so on. And I had done a lot of reading about the first Indochina War, about the French. I had read people like Bernard Fall, and the history of the first Indochina War. And I was very skeptical that this was the right war in the right time. I was generally anti-colonialist. I thought that European powers should have given up their colonies after the Second World War, which was the position of President Roosevelt, who told the British, give India back to the Indians and so on. And he had told the French too, get out of Vietnam and leave them. These are people who have run their own affairs for 2,000 years. Are you going to tell them how to do it? It was just not the right war to be fighting. It took European powers, the French, the Dutch, the British, a long time to realize this. And for the Americans to come in after the French had been defeated and support some of the Vietnamese against other Vietnamese, in other words, to involve themselves in a civil war, looked to a lot of Vietnamese like recolonization. And that was a very powerful propaganda point for the Viet Cong. The Americans they're trying to colonize you like the French did. We fought the French, we beat the French, now we've got to fight the Americans. And that's what they did.
Tell us more about the photo and story of the young female Viet Cong who was killed leading an attack.
That was something I will never forget, because they overran one corner of that Special Forces camp, and she was there, and she'd clearly been leading the attack. And when you have that sort of dedication, you've really got a very powerful enemy there, and that was what I wanted to say by stressing that you're fighting people who are prepared to attack under those conditions, and she was very young. This is going to be a very difficult war to win, and so that was the point of writing the story that way. Because I think a lot of people who went to Vietnam initially, and remember I was there for the years 65 and 66, and initially there was a strong sort of feeling, almost an assumption, that the Americans were going to win this war. And I was skeptical myself, but it's very easy for me to be skeptical. I'm not an American. I'm working for an American news agency, but I can take a step back. I don't have any powerful feelings of patriotism to convince me that we were right about doing what we were doing. But a lot of the guys who were there, whether they were in the military or whether they were the press, there's an implicit assumption that if we're involved in a war that was aimed at preventing a communist takeover of Southeast Asia, that you were in it to win it. So it was a lot easier for me to take that position, not being an American. I mean, everybody. I was the only non-American working for UPI. The AP had a New Zealander, a Kiwi, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his journalism in Vietnam, and that was Peter Arnett, very good friend of mine. And even though we were on the other side, he was in the AP and I was UPI. But it was easier for Peter and I to take that sort of step back. I never felt it was my war, but a lot of Americans felt very strongly that it was their war. And so because it wasn't my war, I never carried a weapon on principle. You know, we talked about this a lot in Frankie's house and that sort of thing. And we knew very well that if we were in a really tight spot, there would be weapons. You wouldn't have to carry one in. There'd be plenty around.
Newspapers such as the New York Times even supported the war early on. Why?
Yes, I think in part it was because you could take these reports of what happened on one operation, and remember, you know, people like myself who were accompanying troops in the field. That's just one view of one little corner of a much wider operation, a huge sweep and destroy operation. Maybe what I saw didn't happen anywhere else but there. So to take that as what was, you know, what was happening throughout Vietnam, well, maybe I got it wrong, or not so much that I got it wrong, but just that you've got to balance that against reports of successful operations in other parts of the country, or even in other parts of that same operation, that things had gone much better. And so you could justify that in the news desk and saying, well, that if we run this, it's going to give a sort of negative view that is really may not be a true portrayal of what's happening across, you know, a very complex military landscape. So there's some justification, I think, but for the pacification series that I did, they just didn't really want to know. I mean, I came back to Australia briefly after that, at the end of '66, and I was interviewed in Canberra on the war, and we've talked about pacification. I was talking to the guy beforehand, and I was telling him about pacification, and this is for a TV. And it was in the middle of an election campaign. And he said, well, you know, how long if the pacification goes ahead like this, how long is it going to take to pacify Vietnam? And I said, I think about 20 years at the rate we're progressing. And he said, God, you can't say that. We're in the middle of a campaign. The opposition is going to want equal time and all the, you know. So a lot of it was people didn't want to know, really. They wanted to believe that they were winning, that we were defeating the communists. We didn't want to be told that the communists were getting the better of us.
Did someone in the U.S. government kill a story that you had written?
All I know is that I wrote up a story about this. I got caught in the middle of a monsoon, and a truck stopped to pick me up. The driver was Vietnamese, and we drove into this camp that I'd never seen before, not too far from Vung Tau, and we sat in the rain, and pouring down, and he spoke quite good English, and I said, you know, what is this camp? So he told me the whole story. We're training people to go in and seek to assassinate VC agents that have been identified, and that sort of thing. So anyway, so I wrote the story and sent it to Tokyo, and I know it was sent out from Tokyo to Japanese newspapers because I got a copy sent me of the story in Japanese. And I know it was sent on from Tokyo to New York, and I know it never appeared in an American newspaper. So I assume that the powers that be got wind of this in Tokyo, got onto UPI in New York saying, spike this story. We don't want it out. That's all I can assume. But it's an assumption. I don't know. The CIA had coverage of all journalists, had a folder, a file on every journalist in Vietnam. In fact, even when I was in Laos, I was told by one guy who I knew was CIA, he said, "We've got a file on you that thick." and so I said, "Oh yeah, well that's good." Actually, I subsequently tried to get a look at my file, and I wrote to the CIA and requested a look at my file, and they said, "Well, but it's a court case. You've got to go through a court case to get it, and that had to be in the U.S. and I was not in the U.S. And it was going to be very, very difficult to get hold of it. But in the letter back, they said to me that they are not confirming or disconfirming that they do have information on me. But they did on everybody. There was nothing unusual.
You wrote that on occasion the military would deny an event happened, then a reporter provided pictures that it did. Was this military incompetence or malfeasance?
I think in part it was lack of communications. It was between, for instance, take the famous case up of the Marines, where CBS, we were reporting. I reported this for UPI about the burning of a village by GIs with cigarette lighters lighting the thatch and the village. They burnt the village, and that story went out, and the Marines denied it. I don't know. I mean, I don't think there was any Marine PIO with Morley Safer, who was the CBS correspondent who filmed that. But you see, you can get a story out within a few hours. But to get movie film across to the States and get it out on the channel, 7 o'clock news, takes another 24 hours, and that's what happened. And so by the time CBS got it out on the evening news the day later, they were able to read at the same time as you're looking at this happening, read the Marine denial, which came out of Hawaii. So that did happen on a few occasions. The other time that it happened was if you were out in a field in the field and then managed to get in back to Saigon with some story and say a number of KIA and got to the 5 o'clock follies and questioned the number of KIA. You say, well, look, I've just come from the headquarters of that unit, Captain, and they're quoting me a number XYZ, and you've got a higher number. I don't know where you got it from, but and this sort of banter went on. It was part of the questioning. It was a very strange war, really. I mean, you could go anywhere at any time. We hitchhiked on helicopters, the press. There was nowhere that sort of laid down the final version of what happened, because they knew very well, the military, that there could well be press on an operation. You just were not sure. We used to be briefed for very large operations that the military wanted covered. They would let us know that an operation was due to kick off on such and such a morning. And we would go there, we would get a briefing the evening before, and on the understanding that nothing could be written about this. And nothing ever was. That was always part of the deal. You got information about an operation that was never telegraphed in a story. You did not let people, the enemy, know that you were about to, sweep them through some area or other. But you didn't know, the military didn't know where the press that were covering that operation had ended up, with what unit, with what platoon here or there, or whether they'd gone out on a medevac chopper, or, you couldn't keep track of everyone on a big operation like that, where you've got, journalists, photojournalists, TV crews, all covering the same major operation.
Tell us about the South Vietnamese soldier who previously was Viet Minh and had fought the French.
This was the pacification program. There was they sent these 59-man teams into villages. There would be a defense team, platoon, about 33 men for defense, and then there would be 3 civic action groups. And this was the brainchild of this guy, Nguyen Bay, and who'd previously been with the Viet Minh. And there were a lot of people with the Viet Minh who were not communists. They were nationalists. They were fighting the French. They wanted to free their country. And so when Vietnam was divided between a communist North and a non-communist South, a lot of these guys ended up down in the South, where the people still in command and control of the South Vietnamese military had been fighting on the side of the French. These people were always suspect in their eyes, ex-Viet Minh were always suspect. Maybe they were really communists. Now they're saying they're not communists. Well, maybe they're actually spies. Maybe they're going to infiltrate. You had plenty of Vietnamese, pro-communist Vietnamese, who had infiltrated the southern military and other structures.
Why didn't UPI want black and white photos?
Oh, they just didn't have the technology of it. They just hadn't. That was not a major concern to get color photographs, because what they were supplying newspapers, and newspapers in those days did not use color photographs. They only used black and white. And also to get to process the black and white and then get it on the wire was fairly straightforward. But color film had to be shipped to either Tokyo or right back to the States and processed there. So it was just that the technology wasn't available. If we were covering the war today in the way that we did in Vietnam, then I'm sure we would all be taking color film.
Elaborate on your moonlighting while at UPI.
Yeah, that was the only time that happened. I was on an operation and where Time had a correspondent on it. And so we were out in the field together. But Time in those days had correspondents and photographers. And UPI did too. Sometimes on a major operation, I would be working with a photographer. We would both take photographs, but you were working with another photographer. So in this case, something happened, and the Time photographer didn't get on the operation. So Time had their correspondent out there writing up this whole thing. They had a deadline, and I'd been taking some color film. Sometimes UPI would supply color film to magazines. But I had, in this case, I had not been asked to take color film. I just had color loaded in one of my cameras. The pictures were not great. But anyway, the Time guy, who's a good friend of mine, I mean, I knew him there, he said, look, can you give me the film? We're desperate. And so I did. And then I only told UPI afterwards. I said, you know, they asked could they use my film, and I said okay. And so we explained things, and they understood. Time still paid me for it, but UPI didn't pay me a great deal. You know, you risk your life for a couple $100 a week. Oh, about a couple of $100 a week, I think it was in those days. I mean, that's worth a lot more then than it was now. It just got paid into a bank in New York. I mean, we weren't really there for the money, I guess. Some of us, and I was just interested in the war, in what was happening. But some people were there to make enough, to make a name, and to make enough money, like the freelance photojournalists. And at first there would only be one or two like Tim Page, but over time more came in because they could see it was really very easy to get accreditation. All you had to have was a letter from your hometown paper saying that you were going to be their correspondent in Vietnam. And it could be a tiny little place nobody's ever heard of, you know, in Arkansas or something. And then these guys would turn up, you know, with a camera and a letter. And before you knew it, they're out with the troops.
Describe Sean Flynn.
Well, Sean was, as you know, a film star, and he was tall. He was, I mean, I'm 6'1", tall. Sean was at least an inch or so taller than me, and extraordinarily good looking. You know, the kind of guy who walks into a room and stops the conversation. And he was. But he'd been doing that sort of thing as son of Errol Flynn, and he'd been starring in a few small movies, Son of Captain Blood being one of them. But he was in Vietnam for sort of much more to prove himself. At first, it was just out of curiosity, and because he was Sean Flynn, he got a contract with Barry Match. But then he got interested in what was happening there, special forces and that sort of thing. He hung out with us. I just felt that Sean was there to prove that, you know, his father, famous as he was, could portray a warrior, but Sean proved that he could match any of them. He would go out with the special forces. He'd go and spend a month up on a special forces camp, going out on patrols with them. We couldn't afford that. We had stories to do. So we couldn't do that. We just had to get on the next operation and the one after that and the one after that. So, and in the end, though, Sean had proved himself enough. And when Tim Page was badly wounded for that fourth time, Sean just wanted out. And Sean and my brother went down to Bali, and my brother did move to Bali, and lived in Bali for 18 years, and did his doctorate there, and wrote about Indonesia. And Sean was going to go down there and do what David did, and buy a house. And he had met an Indonesian girlfriend, and then just one last trip into Cambodia in 1970 when the Americans went in, and he was picked up at a Khmer Rouge roadblock. Never seen again.
How did journalists' deaths and injuries influence you? Martin will talk about Sam Caston, who was a journalist for Look magazine. Martin writes, Sam Caston was the first journalist whom we all knew well to be killed in Vietnam, and his death had a profound effect on us all. A commemoration of Sam is here in the War Remnants Museum at Ho Chi Minh City and reads, Sam Caston died fighting. He was a civilian journalist who became a warrior in the last minutes of his life, leading a small, desperate group of American soldiers out of a trap, saving their lives, losing his own. He had joined the story he came to cover, and the story ennobled him.
It does bring home the risks. Just before Sam Caston hung out with us, you see, I mean, he had a hotel, but he would spend evenings with us at Frankie's house. And in fact, we all celebrated his, I think it was 32nd birthday, with Frankie's house and Sam. And before he went up country the last time, he and I went up on the roof because he was really concerned about what was happening and whether or not this was a war that could be won. And he was going to write a story for Look magazine, with this sort of slant to it. And I remember spending about 2 hours up on the roof of Frankie's house one night, talking about, the war and my doubts about it and how it was being fought and how the body count was just distorting an understanding of what was going on. And then to hear, a day or two later that he'd been killed, it brings it home to you, and it could happen. And after I had that helicopter crash, and I think we all made a decision after about a year to 2 years, depending on different people. We didn't want to die in Vietnam. There were other things to do with our lives, and war, as far as I was concerned, was never much of an attractive proposition. I was interested in what was going on there because I was interested in the history of French Indochina, which is what I ended up writing about when I became an academic. Well, he had come back to Saigon to pack up his apartment, and as far as David was, Joe Galloway had been given the Jakarta Bureau. All of us, our young group working for UPI, the offer was that you do a year or two covering the war, we'll look after you. And so Joe went to Jakarta, and another young guy came after me, Bob Kaler, ended up in New Delhi. And so, I could have gone somewhere too like that, because there was, you'd done your time, as it was, taken the risks, got the stories, and UPI recognized that. But some people just got hooked on it. I mean, Peter Arnett for the AP was there until the end, and there were others too. But it was not something I was hooked on. It was not my war. It was interesting for a while, but I didn't want to die in Vietnam, and nor did any of us at Frankie's house, frankly. So we all got out. Only Sam was actually killed on patrol in pretty heroic circumstances, actually, leading the last group of GIs trying to break an ambush and get back to the main force. And he was killed doing that. But the rest of us ended up in either staying with journalism, like Joe Galloway, or with photography. I mean, Steve Northup, who was at Frankie's house, ended up as the photographer, White House photographer for the Washington Post, and tracked around the world with various presidents, and then was a photographer for Time Life for about 20 years on staff. I mean, he's a really top level photographer. Page got very badly hit, and but came back to photography, but not to war photography. And Joe Galloway stayed in journalism. Simon Dring stayed in journalism. And my brother and I ended up in academia. The problem with wire service journalism is you get a request from New York. They tell you, give me 800 words on the Indian economy by tomorrow afternoon. Well, India's a big country. It's a complex economy. If you want to try and compress it into 800 words, I don't know what sort of understanding of the Indian economy you're going to get across. And I got a bit tired of that, of wire service journalism. In Frankie's house, none of us were religious. None of us, I mean, we used to joke with Page, they'll get you next time, Page. And after he got wounded a couple of times, particularly after the third time when he was shot up on that Coast Guard cutter. No, we were not superstitious. I think I can say that on behalf of all of us. That he just attracted lead. But that was just a joke sort of thing. I mean, go on, Page, they'll get you next time. But I mean, it was a way of sort of minimizing what was for us pretty constantly on the back of your mind. I mean, are you going to come back from the next operation or not? I saw no racial tension within the military out in the field. So I remember going with one Marine battalion, and the captain was Japanese American. His lieutenant was a Chinese American. There were all of the three sergeants were all black, very experienced, and the racial mix there were Latinos, there were everyone you could imagine. But that didn't matter. They were Marines. They were Marines and proud of being Marines. And there was a very strong feeling of but out in the field, and acts of heroism, of making sure that you got the bodies in, and left no one out there. And so in small groups, there wasn't that. But go back to Saigon, and blacks mingled with blacks, and whites mingled with whites, and there were black bars and white bars. You could find along some of the bigger bars in Tudo or something, you could find a bit of a mix. But this guy that I met, who is a sergeant in the 1st Air Cav, and he said to me, I took him to Frankie's house, I think, and then he said, I'll take you out to a bar you will never have been in. and it was a part of town that we didn't hang out there, and it was a black bar, and I walked in there, and I was the only white guy there. There were all the Vietnamese girls were there, you know, still plying their trade, but they're all black, and there were a lot of guys there who were sort of looking at me and saying, "Well, what's he doing there?" And as much as to say to the fellow who brought him in, "Okay, you brought him in, now take him out." I did not feel comfortable in that bar, in that circumstance. This was for blacks, and they really didn't want me there, I felt. Paul was French, of course, but he spoke very good English, and he mostly, he wrote in both languages. But I had read what he had written about the First Indochina War, and he was attached to some American university. I forget which one it was now. And he came out to Vietnam to do a story for, I think, some news magazine comparing the French experience in Vietnam with the American experience. And to do that, of course, he went out with the troops, and he was killed. He tripped a booby trap and was killed in Vietnam. But I spent some time with him. We found ourselves on the same flight up from Saigon to Nha Trang, and I don't know, the flight was delayed. Anyway, I sat and talked to him for a couple of hours in the Ton Son Nhut airport, and then on the flight up and so on, and then we stayed in the same place up in Nha Trang before an operation. Given his background and his knowledge of the First Indochina War, we sort of found ourselves on much the same wavelength. And I think he felt that I was an Australian, even though we had Australian troops there. I made it quite clear that I had reservations about the war, and he did too. And so, it was just really a matter of in large part seeing eye to eye, but mainly of me listening to him talking about the French experience. That contrasts, Paul, with an American Marine major that I met in Da Nang and got a bit sozzled with one evening, and we were talking about preparations, because I was interested to know what sort of preparations did Marine officers get before being sent to Vietnam. And I said, well, did you study the French experience in the First Indochina War? And he said, no, we didn't worry about that. And I said, why not? Surely that's what you should be studying if you want to go and fight that same sort of war against the same enemy. And he just said, hey, those guys lost. So why would you study their experience? I was just absolutely stunned. Frankie's house had one large first floor room, which was air conditioned. It was the only one, and we tossed for it, and Tim Page won it. And that was where we always congregated, because it was the only. I mean, it used to be the sort of, I guess, the family sitting room, and so we would just sit there. At the times that we were in Saigon, we were a lot of the time up country or with one unit or another. But when we were together, or when we were back in Saigon, we would recount stories and talk about the war what have you, and pass around it and sip our cognac, courtesy of the PX, and welcome anybody who wanted to drop in. And if you felt like sending Frankie out for the guy, well, for a couple of pipes, you could do that. Some did. Oh, I think it is emotional. You think of Mike Herr, who wrote Dispatches. He was in Vietnam in total, not as long as we were in Frankie's house, and he had PTSD as a result of the experiences that he'd been through. Mind you, he was a Khe Sanh, and that was before that was after I left, rather. So I was not under that sort of attack, incoming, as they said. But he had what we would now call PTSD. And for five years, he said, he couldn't write about it. Eventually, he wrote Dispatches. But Dispatches came out 10 years after Herr was in Vietnam. And it took him that long to put that book together, which is as much literature as it is reportage. It's a very fine book. But I think we all had PTSD. It took us a long time. Some marriages broke up. If you were married, I wasn't at the time. It was, and in Saigon, it was pretty well impossible to maintain any kind of relationship. I mean, there weren't that many women in the embassies and so on that you could get to know. So there was only sort of brief encounters with bar girls. And that's pretty unsatisfying.
In a future video focusing on Tim Page and Sean Flynn, I will share some of Martin's interview about working with Tim in Laos. As always, thank you for watching.